In 1970, the muscle car wars were supposedly won by horsepower, the biggest numbers, the loudest claims, the most cubic inches screaming at redline. Buick didn't care about any of that. They built an engine that made 510 pound-feet of torque at 2,800 RPM, a figure so monstrous it embarrassed every legend Detroit had ever produced. HEMI, 490, LS6, 500, Boss 429, not even close. And they put it in a car with opera windows and a luxury interior. This is the story of the 455 Stage 1, the gentleman's muscle car that destroyed everything at the drag strip, then drove home in air-conditioned comfort. In 1970, Buick's engineers did something Detroit wasn't prepared for. They took a massive V8, bored it out to 455 cubic inches, and tuned it not for peak horsepower, but for something far more devastating on the street: instant, overwhelming torque. The result was the Stage 1 package, an option so potent it turned the Buick Grand Sport into one of the fastest production cars in the world. Not the loudest, not the flashiest, but when the pavement started moving beneath you, nothing pulled harder. This wasn't about cubic inches for bragging rights. It wasn't about triple-digit horsepower claims or NASCAR homologation specials. This was about one thing: making a car that could destroy anything else from a roll, from a dig, or from a traffic light, all while looking like it just left the country club. The automotive press couldn't believe it. Hot Rod called it the quickest production sedan we've ever tested. Car and Driver praised its effortless, relentless acceleration. Motor Trend admitted they'd underestimated Buick entirely. Road and Track, typically dismissive of American muscle, called the torque curve almost diesel-like in its relentlessness. And yet, this engine, this legend, came from a brand most muscle car fans dismissed as irrelevant. Street racers who'd lost to GSXs couldn't reconcile the badge with the performance. Dodge and Plymouth dealers struggled to explain how a Buick had just walked their HEMI cars from 40 miles per hour. Chevrolet engineers quietly pulled Stage 1 models into testing facilities, trying to understand what Buick had done differently. The answer was simple, brilliant, and completely counter to everything the muscle car wars had taught Detroit: forget the peak numbers. Build power where people actually drive. The year was 1965, and General Motors was printing money. Pontiac had the GTO, the car that started it all, the machine that proved young Americans would buy performance in a mid-size package. Chevrolet had the Chevelle SS, dominating drag strips and sales charts simultaneously. Oldsmobile had the 442, sophisticated and brutally fast. Every division inside the General Motors empire was building performance. Cars chasing younger buyers and feeding the horsepower war that defined the American automotive landscape. But Buick was stuck in the past. The brand had built its reputation on quiet comfort and middle-class aspiration. Buick owners wanted soft suspension, chrome trim, and smooth automatic transmissions. They wanted elegance, refinement, a car that whispered instead of shouted. The average Buick buyer was 47 years old. The average GTO buyer was 26. Performance was someone else's problem, except the market was changing. Muscle cars were no longer niche products for drag racers and hot rodders. They were mainstream. Pontiac's GTO had proven that young buyers would flock to affordable, powerful coupes. Plymouth's Roadrunner was dominating sales charts. Even AMC, tiny struggling AMC, was building up the Javelin and trying to compete. Buick's sales were stagnant. Dealers were frustrated, watching Pontiac and Chevrolet stores across the street sell 3 performance cars for every 1 Buick sedan. And inside GM's Flint Engineering Center, a small group of engineers started asking dangerous questions. What if Buick could build a muscle car that didn't just compete, but dominated? The man leading that charge was Cliff Studeker, a soft-spoken engineer who'd spent years working on Buick's large displacement V8s. Studeker wasn't interested in high-revving small blocks or exotic valve trains. He believed in a different philosophy: displacement and torque. Big cubes, long strokes, massive low-end grunt. He'd watched the horsepower wars escalate throughout the 60s, compression ratios climbing into the stratosphere, camshafts getting wilder, engines requiring premium fuel and constant tuning. He knew that path led to engines that were fast on paper but miserable on the street. Engines that idled rough, ran hot, and required perfect conditions to deliver their advertised performance. Studeker wanted something different, something that worked everywhere, every time. In 1967, Buick released the GS 400, a Grand Sport coupe with a 400 cubic inch V8, making 340 horsepower. It was competitive, respectable. It could run with the mid-tier muscle cars and hold its own against anything short of the absolute monsters. But it wasn't enough. Studeker knew they could go further. By 1969, GM had lifted its internal displacement limits, a corporate edict that had kept engines under 400 cubic inches for everything except full-size cars. The ban was over. The gloves were off. And Buick finally had the green light to build the engine it had always wanted. The engineering team bored and stroked the 400 out to 455 cubic inches, one of the largest production engines GM would ever produce. But here's where Buick made a decision that separated it from every other muscle car in Detroit. Instead of chasing peak horsepower with high compression and aggressive camshafts, they optimized for torque. They kept the compression reasonable, 10.5 to 1, so the engine could run on pump gas without detonation. They spec'd a camshaft with relatively mild lift and duration, prioritizing cylinder filling at low RPM. They engineered large port cylinder heads that flowed massively at lower velocities. They chose durability over maximum output. And then they added the Stage 1 package. Functional ram air induction that actually worked, not just cosmetic scoops. A hotter camshaft still mild by Mopar or Pontiac standards. Stronger internals, forged pistons, heavy-duty rods, hardened crank. A Rochester Quadra J carburetor calibrated for instant throttle response. The result was 360 horsepower at 4,600 RPM. Impressive, but not class-leading. The HEMI made 425. The LS6 made 450. Even the Boss 429 claimed 375. But the torque figure? That was something else entirely. 510 pound-feet at 2,800 RPM. That number made engineers at Chrysler and Ford take notice. It made Chevrolet nervous, and it made Buick dealers start believing they could actually sell performance cars. Internal GM documents from 1969 reveal the doubt. Executives questioned whether Buick's brand image could support a true muscle car. Marketing departments worried that the refined, upscale Buick buyer would be alienated by aggressive performance marketing. Accountants calculated the cost of tooling and wondered if the investment would pay off. But Studeker and his team had the data. They had dyno sheets showing torque curves that looked like plateaus, not just massive, sustained pulling power from 2,000 RPM all the way to redline. They had test cars that annihilated everything in roll racing scenarios. They had feedback from dealers who'd driven pre-production Stage 1 models and came back grinning like kids. The decision was made. The Stage 1 would go into production for 1970, but the real test wasn't on paper. It wasn't in boardrooms or on dynos. It was on the street and on the drag strip, where reputation was built 1/4 mile at a time. The Stage 1 was about to prove that horsepower sold cars, but torque won races. Pull open the hood of a 1970 Buick GSX and you're staring at 455 cubic inches of pure American iron. The block itself is a work of understated brilliance, cast iron, heavy, thick-walled. Buick used a deep skirt design that extended the cylinder walls well below the crankshaft centerline, creating incredible structural rigidity. This wasn't just strong, it was overbuilt in the best possible way. The block weighed over 200 pounds bare, giving the front end the kind of planted feeling that made high-speed launches controllable. The crankshaft had a stroke of 3.9 inches, among the longest in any American production V8. Compare that to the Chevy LS6's 4.00-inch stroke, or the HEMI's 3.75. Longer stroke means the piston travels farther per revolution, which translates directly into torque. Think of it like leverage. A longer wrench arm moves more weight with less effort. That's what this crank did. It turned combustion pressure into rotating force with devastating efficiency. The bore was 4.31 inches, big enough to breathe but not so over-square that it needed high RPM to make power. The combination created an engine that was naturally suited to low-speed torque production. Physics was on Buick's side. The pistons were forged, not cast, and fitted with heavier-duty rings to handle the pressures of sustained acceleration. Buick knew this engine would spend its life under load, not cruising at highway speeds. Every component was selected for durability under stress. The connecting rods were shot-peened and magnafluxed. The main bearings were oversized. The oil pump was high volume. This engine was built to be raced. Cylinder heads were the secret weapon. Buick engineers designed large port heads that moved enormous volumes of air, even at relatively low lift. The intake ports were nearly as large as those found on big block Chevys, but the valve train was far more efficient. The valves themselves, 2.00-inch intakes and 1.625-inch exhausts, were sized perfectly for the engine's operating range. Here's what made them brilliant. While Mopar was chasing high RPM flow with small ports and high velocity, Buick went the opposite direction. Big ports, low velocity, massive volume. The result was an engine that filled its cylinders completely at lower engine speeds, creating cylinder pressure that translated directly into torque. The Stage 1 camshaft was mild by muscle car standards. Lift was moderate, just 0.457 inches on the intake. Duration was conservative, 276 degrees, but the cam profile was optimized for one specific goal: maximizing cylinder pressure between 2,000 and 4,000 RPM. This is where street cars actually lived. This is where roll racing happened. This is where stoplight battles were won. The lobe separation angle was 114 degrees, wide by performance standards, which improved low-end torque and idle quality. The valve timing created strong cylinder filling without excessive overlap that would have hurt low RPM power. Everything was calculated for one purpose: torque where you could use it. The intake system was functional, not decorative. The hood scoops weren't just for show, and they fed cool, dense air directly into a low-restriction air cleaner mounted to the quadrajet carburetor. The air cleaner housing was designed with minimal turbulence, maintaining laminar flow all the way to the carburetor ventures. The Rochester quadrajet carburetor was a masterpiece of tuning, capable of flowing over 800 CFM while maintaining crisp throttle response at part throttle. The small primary ventures gave excellent low-speed drivability. The massive secondaries opened progressively under load, feeding the engine everything it could swallow. The accelerator pump was calibrated perfectly. Instant response with no bog, no hesitation. And then there was the exhaust. Dual exhaust with minimal restriction. The manifolds were cast iron but free-flowing. The pipes were 2.5 inches, large enough to breathe, not so large that back pressure disappeared and low-end torque suffered. The mufflers were straight-through designs that flowed well but still maintained some resonance. The sound wasn't loud, it was authoritative, a deep, burbling idle that built into a thunderous roar under acceleration. The exhaust note didn't scream like a small block. It bellowed. It resonated in your chest. It announced itself without shouting. Put it all together and you had an engine that made 510 pound-feet of torque at just 2,800 RPM. To put that in perspective, the legendary Chrysler 426 HEMI made 490 pound-feet, 20 less, and at a higher RPM. The Chevrolet LS6 454 made 500 pound-feet, still short of the Buick. The Ford 429 Cobra Jet, 480 pound-feet. The Pontiac Ram Air 4, 445. Even the legendary L88 Corvette, Chevy's racing special, made only 460 pound-feet. Nothing touched the Stage 1. Period tests confirmed what the numbers promised. Hot Rod magazine tested a 1970 GSX Stage 1 and recorded a quarter-mile time of 13.38 seconds at 105 miles per hour. Car and Driver called it the fastest car we've tested this year and recorded 0 to 60 in 5.5 seconds. Motor Trend wrote that the low-end torque was simply staggering and noted that the car pulled like a freight train from any speed in any gear. Superstock and Drag Illustrated tested a Stage 1 automatic and ran 13.56 at 104, remarkable for a car with a 2-speed power glide transmission. They noted that the Buick requires less driver skill than any muscle car we've tested. Just mat the throttle and steer. Drivers described the sensation as otherworldly. You didn't have to rev the engine. You didn't have to downshift. You didn't have to time anything. You just pressed the throttle from any speed, at any RPM, and the car surged forward like it had been rear-ended by a freight train. Highway passing, Touch the gas at 70 miles per hour in top gear and feel the immediate surge. No downshift needed, no waiting for power. Just instant violent acceleration, roll racing from 40. The Stage 1 was unbeatable. While other cars had to drop gears and build RPM, the Buick was already making full torque. The driver in the other car would see the GSX start to pull, realize what was happening, and watch helplessly as the Buick disappeared into the distance. That was the genius of the Stage 1. It delivered full, usable power exactly where real-world driving happened. It made heroes out of average drivers and turned stoplight races into executions. Period road tests noted something else. The Stage 1 was reliable. While HEMIs needed constant tuning and LS6s were temperamental, the Buick just worked. It started in any weather, it idled smoothly in traffic, it ran on regular premium pump gas without detonation, it didn't overheat, it didn't foul plugs. It was improbably both the fastest and most civilized muscle car you could buy. But every revolution has its breaking point, and this one was about to face its own. By 1971, the world Buick had built the Stage 1-4 was collapsing. The horsepower war that had defined the 1960s was over. Not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic whimper. Insurance companies had started charging exorbitant premiums for high-performance cars, pricing young buyers out of the market. A 22-year-old with a Hemi Cuda might pay $3,000 annually for insurance, more than the down payment on the car itself. Federal emissions regulations were tightening, forcing manufacturers to add restrictive exhaust systems, air pumps, and catalytic converters. The Clean Air Act was squeezing performance from every angle, and the oil crisis was looming, a catastrophe that would redefine America's relationship with gasoline forever. But the first blow came from within General Motors itself. In 1971, GM mandated that all divisions switch from SAE gross horsepower ratings to SAE net ratings, a more honest measurement that accounted for real-world accessories like alternators, air cleaners, and exhaust systems. Overnight, the Buick 455 Stage 1 went from 360 horsepower to 315. The engine was mechanically identical, not a single part had changed. But the number, that all-important marketing number, had dropped by 45 horsepower. The perception was devastating. Buyers saw a 45 horsepower loss and assumed the engine had been neutered. Dealers struggled to explain the change, fumbling through technical explanations while customers walked across the street to Pontiac or Chevrolet. Competitors seized the opportunity to claim superiority, running ads that compared their gross numbers to Buick's net ratings. It didn't matter that the engine was mechanically identical. It didn't matter that it still made 510 pound-feet of torque. The marketing damage was done. Sales dropped immediately. Dealers reported that customers who'd been ready to sign suddenly hesitated, convinced that Buick had weakened the engine. The automotive press tried to explain the rating change, but the message didn't penetrate. To most buyers, 315 horsepower sounded weak compared to what they'd read the year before. Then came the compression drop. To meet emission standards and run on lower-octane unleaded fuel, Buick reduced compression ratios across the board. The Stage 1's 10.5-to-1 compression fell to 8.5-to-1 by 1972. That's a massive drop from premium fuel territory to regular unleaded in one model year. The camshaft was softened, lift dropped, duration shortened. The carburetor was recalibrated for leaner mixtures to reduce hydrocarbon emissions. Air pumps were added, strangling the exhaust flow. Ignition timing was retarded. Torque dropped to 390 pound-feet. Horsepower fell to 270. The engine that had once embarrassed HEMIs now struggled to keep pace with mid-tier small blocks. Quarter-mile times that had been in the low 13s were now mid-14s. The visceral, immediate torque was still there, but muffled, like listening to thunder through a closed window instead of standing in the storm. Engineers inside Buick watched helplessly as their creation was legislated into mediocrity. Cliff Studeker and his team had built an engine that solved real-world performance problems, and the real world had moved on. Internal documents from the era reveal the frustration. One memo from 1972 noted that the Stage 1 package no longer provides meaningful performance differentiation. Another proposed turbocharging to restore output, but the suggestion was rejected due to cost and complexity. They experimented with fuel injection prototypes, knowing that precise fuel control could improve both emissions and power. But electronic fuel injection was expensive, unreliable, and years away from production viability. They argued for lighter vehicle platforms to offset power losses. If the cars weighed less, they reasoned, the reduced power wouldn't hurt performance as much. But GM was moving in the opposite direction, adding safety equipment, crash structures, and emissions hardware that made cars heavier with each passing year. None of it mattered. General Motors was pivoting toward fuel economy, safety, and emissions compliance. Performance was a liability, not an asset. The muscle car era was ending, and Buick's greatest engine was being buried in the transition. Sales reflected the collapse. In 1970, Buick sold over 13,000 Grand Sport models, impressive for a brand that had never been associated with performance. By 1972, that number had fallen to fewer than 8,000. By 1973, it was under 5,000. The GSX, the halo car, the statement piece, the rolling billboard that announced Buick's performance intentions, was discontinued after just 2 model years. Only 678 were built in 1970 and 124 in 1971. The market for expensive, high-performance Buicks simply didn't exist in sufficient numbers. Street racers who'd bought Stage 1 models in 1970 found themselves with cars that had lost value overnight. The prestige of owning the torque king of Detroit meant nothing when buyers wanted economy cars and emissions compliance. By 1974, the Stage 1 option was quietly dropped from the order sheet. No press release, no farewell tour, no final edition with commemorative badging. It just disappeared from the option codes, erased like it had never existed. The press barely noticed. Car and Driver wrote a brief obituary, noting that the Buick Stage 1 was one of the great sleepers of the muscle car era, and now it's gone. Hot Rod didn't mention it at all, focused instead on the new wave of small displacement, emissions-compliant engines. Enthusiasts who'd bought them new held on tightly, knowing they'd purchased something special. But for most of the automotive world, the 455 Stage 1 simply faded into history, another casualty of changing times and federal regulation. The question hung in the air like unburned fuel. How did it all go wrong? The answer was simple and brutal. The Stage 1 had been perfectly engineered for a world that no longer existed. When the dust settled in the mid-1970s, Buick's performance reputation had evaporated. The brand that had built the torque king of American muscle was back to building soft-riding sedans and personal luxury coupes. The Grand Sport name lingered on, but it was attached to economy V6s and emission-choked V8s that made less power than the family station wagon. By 1975, the Grand Sport option on a Buick Century meant nothing more than some stripes and upgraded suspension. The engine was a 155-horsepower V8 that struggled to break 16 seconds in the quarter mile. It was embarrassing. Dealers who'd once fought for Stage 1 allocation were now pushing Regals and LeSabres to customers who wanted comfort and fuel economy, not quarter-mile times. The performance parts in dealer parts departments gathered dust. Service departments that had once tuned Stage 1 engines for maximum output were now focused on emissions compliance and fuel economy. The automotive press moved on. Road tests from 1975 and 1976 barely mentioned Buick in performance comparisons. When they did, it was with nostalgia, a wistful acknowledgement that Buick had once built something special before retreating to its comfort zone. Motor Trend's 1976 Buyer's Guide listed exactly 0 Buick models in the performance category. The own brand had been completely erased from that conversation, but among the enthusiasts who'd driven them, the legend grew. Owners of 1970 GSX Stage 1 models began to realize they'd bought something unrepeatable. These weren't flashy cars. They didn't have the brand cachet of a Hemi Cuda or a Boss 429. They didn't appear in movies or on bedroom wall posters, but on the street, in real-world conditions, they were untouchable. Stories circulated. A GSX embarrassing a Corvette on a highway on-ramp. A Stage 1 Grand Sport walking away from a 454 Chevelle from a 40-mile-per-hour roll. A bone-stock Buick running mid-13s at the dragstrip while Mopars broke transmissions and Fords overheated. The cars developed a cult following, small, dedicated, and fiercely loyal. By the early 1980s, muscle car collectors were starting to take notice. HEMIs and LS6s were commanding serious money at auctions. Boss Mustangs and Ram Air Pontiacs were being restored to Concours condition. Six-figure sales were becoming common for the most desirable muscle cars. The Buick Stage 1 remained affordable, undervalued, underappreciated, and largely forgotten by the mainstream collector market. Classified ads from the era tell the story. A 1970 GSX Stage 1 might be listed for $8,000 in 1985, barely more than a used Honda Civic. A comparable HEMI car would bring $30,000, an LS6 Chevelles, $25,000 minimum. Buick simply didn't have the cachet. The badge didn't carry the same weight. To most collectors, a Buick muscle car was a contradiction, an oddity, not a serious investment. But a small group of enthusiasts knew better. They understood that the Stage 1 represented something rare in automotive history: engineering excellence without ego, a car that delivered performance without theatrics, a machine that won races without demanding attention. These enthusiasts formed clubs, shared parts, sourcing information, and preserved documentation. They kept the history alive when the rest of the world had moved on. Technical articles appeared analyzing what made the Stage 1 special. Engineers who'd retired from Buick gave interviews, explaining the design philosophy. Dyno operators who'd tested these engines in period confirmed that the torque curve was unlike anything else, just flat, sustained pulling power across the entire RPM range. The numbers didn't lie. The Stage 1 had been the real deal, and yet, outside of a dedicated group of Buick faithful, the car remained a footnote in muscle car history, overshadowed by louder, flashier, more legendary names. The HEMI got the movies, the LS6 got the auction records. The Boss 429 got the mystique. The Stage 1 got forgotten, but history has a habit of rediscovering what it once discarded. 30 years after production ended, the Buick 455 Stage 1 began receiving the recognition it had always deserved. Collector car auctions in the 2000s saw values skyrocket. A 1970 GSX Stage 1 that might have sold for $15,000 in 1995 was bringing $60,000 by 2010. Rare color combinations, Saturn yellow, Apollo white, commanded six figures. By 2020, a pristine GSX Stage 1 with documentation could hit $200,000 at Meckham or Barrett-Jackson. The market had finally caught up to the reality. Restoration shops specializing in Buicks emerged, documenting original specifications and tracking down NOS parts. Enthusiast forums exploded with build threads, dyno sheets, and period documentation. The Buick GS Club of America grew from a few hundred members to thousands. Regional chapters held shows dedicated exclusively to Grand Sport models. The Stage 1 was no longer a forgotten underdog, it was a recognized legend, but the legacy went deeper than collector value. Modern automotive engineers began revisiting the Stage 1's design philosophy, recognizing its relevance in an era dominated by turbocharged engines and electric motors. The idea of prioritizing torque over horsepower, of building engines that delivered power where drivers actually needed it, was suddenly fashionable again. Today's turbocharged V6 engines from Ford, GM, and others produce torque curves that look remarkably similar to the Stage 1 for massive low-end grunt with relatively modest peak horsepower. The 3.5-liter EcoBoost in the Ford F-150, for example, makes 470 pound-feet of torque at just 2,500 RPM, a direct philosophical descendant of Buick's 1970 masterpiece. The Ford EcoBoost Mustang makes 400 pound-feet at 2,500 RPM. The Chevrolet Camaro's turbocharged four-cylinder makes 295 pound-feet at 3,000 RPM. Modern BMW V8s make peak torque at 1,800 RPM. All of them prove Buick was right in 1970. Electric vehicles took the concept even further. Instant torque from 0 RPM. No need to revel, no need to downshift. Just immediate, overwhelming acceleration, exactly what the Stage 1 had delivered, but with electrons instead of gasoline. The Tesla Model S Plaid makes 1,020 pound-feet of torque instantly. The Porsche Taycan Turbo S makes 774 pound-feet from a standstill. The Rivian R1T makes 850 pound-feet immediately available. Buick's engineers had been 50 years ahead of the curve. The automotive press eventually acknowledged the oversight. In 2015, Hot Rod published a feature titled "The Muscle Car Detroit Forgot," calling the Stage 1 one of the most underrated performance engines ever built. Hagerty Insurance named it one of the top 10 most collectible muscle cars of the 1970s. Restoration values now reflect that recognition. A numbers-matching 1970 GSX Stage 1 in excellent condition can bring $150,000 at auction. Even non-GSX models, standard Grand Sport coupes with the Stage 1 option, command respect and serious money. A clean, documented Stage 1 hardtop might bring $40,000 to $50,000. Parts availability has improved. Reproduction, hood scoops, trim pieces, and interior components are now available. Engine rebuilders specialize in Stage 1 motors, understanding the specific cam timing, bearing clearances, and tuning requirements that make these engines special. But for the owners who've kept them original, who've preserved the documentation and maintained the drivetrains, the value isn't financial. It's the sound of that engine at idle, the deep, burbling exhaust note that rattles windows and makes heads turn. It's the sensation of pressing the throttle at 2,000 RPM and feeling 500 pound-feet of torque shove you back into the seat. It's knowing you're driving a piece of engineering history that most people never understood. It's pulling up to a car show and watching younger enthusiasts walk past it toward the HEMIs and LS6s, not realizing what they're looking at. Then seeing the knowledgeable collectors, the ones who know, stop and stare and nod with respect. The Stage 1 represents something that's been lost in modern automotive culture, the idea that performance doesn't have to be loud, flashy, or extreme. That refinement and speed aren't mutually exclusive, that the fastest car isn't always the one that shouts the loudest. In an era where muscle cars have become caricatures, supercharged monsters making 1,000 horsepower for Instagram videos, the Stage 1 stands as a reminder of what performance used to mean, not bragging rights, not social media clout, just a car that worked brilliantly every time you drove it. The engineering philosophy lives on in unexpected places. When Ford developed the EcoBoost platform, engineers specifically cited the need for low RPM torque delivery similar to classic big blocks. When GM designed the current generation small block V8, they optimized the cam timing for mid-range torque rather than peak horsepower. The lessons Buick learned in 1970 became industry standard by 2020. Automotive journalists who drive restored Stage 1 models today express surprise at how modern they feel. The torque delivery is similar to a turbocharged engine. The acceleration from low speeds is comparable to contemporary performance cars. The refinement is better than most muscle cars of the era. One recent review noted, "Driving this 1970 GSX feels less like experiencing history and more like driving a concept that's been validated by modern engineering. This is what every muscle car should have been. That might be the ultimate legacy." The sound of that engine wasn't just horsepower, it was defiance cast in iron and aluminum. What began as an experiment in torque optimization became a legend long after the factories went quiet. Picture that drag strip again. Spring of 1970. The silver GSX rolls back to the pits after another winning pass, rear tires still smoking, the smell of burnt rubber hanging in the humid Michigan air. The driver climbs out, barely winded, and leans against the fender while the engine ticks and cools. Someone asks what it runs. He smiles. 1330s, he says, all day long. Another bystander asks how much horsepower. 360, the driver replies. The questioner looks skeptical. His 446 pack makes 390, and it couldn't stay with the Buick. The driver just shrugs and pats the hood. It's not about horsepower, he says. It's about torque. That was the Buick 455 Stage 1. Not the loudest, not the most famous. But when the tree dropped and the pavement started moving, nothing pulled harder. Today, those cars are treasured by enthusiasts who understand that the best muscle cars weren't always the most obvious ones. That sometimes the greatest engineering achievements came from the brands no one expected. That Buick, quiet, refined, understated Buick, built an engine that could out-torque every legend Detroit ever produced. The Stage 1 proved that horsepower might win magazine comparisons, but torque wins races. That low-end grunt matters more than peak numbers. that a car doesn't need to scream to be fast when sometimes the most devastating machines are the ones that whisper until the moment they destroy you. 55 years later, that lesson still resonates. In a world of turbocharged fours and electric motors optimized for instant torque, the Stage 1's philosophy lives on. The technology has changed, but the principle remains. Build power where it's used, not where it's measured. The Stage 1 taught Detroit that refinement and violence could coexist, that a luxury brand could build a weapon, that the customer who wanted leather seats and air conditioning also wanted to embarrass Corvettes at stoplights. Share your story in the comments. Tell us about the first time you experienced that torque. Tell us what it meant to realize that Buick had built the king. Tell us if you've owned one, restored one, or just dreamed about one. And if you're one of the lucky few who still owns a Stage 1, hold on to it. They're not making any more. The world that created them is gone. But the machines remain. Monuments to a moment when American engineering got it exactly right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.